jump ahead to one of the animations. We'll get into demographics and some of the drivers of human mobility in the future. But in terms of, what you said about the number of babies being born is fascinating, because we're all living through this, there we go, this profound moment in world history where the world population is actually going to plateau very soon. It's going to reach a peak. I call it peak humanity. And I'm going to jump, to peak humanity here, right? So this is a moment that we never thought would necessarily arise. For the last 100 years, from 1920 to the year 2000, roughly, the world population quadrupled, right? Quadrupled from 2 billion to 8 billion people. And so we naturally assumed it was just going to keep on growing. But lo and behold, look here. We're entering a global baby bust, as a lot of people call it, right? Fertility is going down, young people are having fewer children, and elderly are passing away. So you basically are reaching this plateau in the curve, and the world population will probably peak at below 10 billion people. So it's a whole different world. Suddenly it's not about fearing overpopulation in the world, it becomes like a distributional issue, right? It's not, you don't have to worry about, oh my God, 20 billion mouths to feed. That's not the issue. It's what are the appropriate places? Where are the appropriate places for 8, 9-ish billion people to survive? And then it's more about kind of reacting to the complexity and the circumstances, like geopolitical circumstances. You know that right now, there are at least 7 or so countries in the world that are the source of at least 1 million or more refugees right now. I can't think of a time in history where there were 7 different conflicts going on where more than 1 million refugees were flowing out. So Ukraine is the obvious one, but we had, Syria has collapsed, Afghanistan has fallen apart again, Venezuela has collapsed. There's about 1 million Rohingya that have fled Myanmar and so forth. So literally, around the world, that's just the political reasons why people migrate. Then economic migrants, people searching for a better life. Latin Americans coming here, Africans moving to Europe, South Asians moving outward, right? Then there's that. And then there's climate change. So let me backtrack a little bit and just look at this for a second. In terms of drivers of migration, I kick off here at the final map that I showed you. This is human geography. Now again, this is not a map that's lying, right? Every human being, every one of us is a pixel on this map. There's 8 billion pixels right here. Now, if you look at climate models that show what happens as temperatures rise around the world, you get this. So talk about, migration pressure, right? There's migration pressure already from the conflicts that we were talking about, migration pressure from economies that are really sort of disintegrating, state failure and so forth. And now you've got this on top of all of that, as if we didn't have enough to deal with, right? And ironically, even though a huge population has been a driver of climate change, even our existing population is still a lot of people. And industrialization, modernization, consuming a lot of resources. Climate change is going to continue, even if the population shrinks, it's still going to continue. So what you're seeing here is something called the suitability index. What it does is to show that if temperatures reach 2 degree higher Celsius, which is kind of where we're headed, or 3 degrees, a red place designates places that are becoming less livable, right? Temperatures are too hot, and you have these wet bulb effects. The temperature doesn't cool off enough at night, so it becomes difficult for your body to kind of acclimatize and so on. Green areas are places that are becoming more livable over time, right? Relative to how livable they are now. So a place that was like super cold, like the Canadian Arctic, right, is actually becoming more livable, right? Like, Alaska too, Russia and so forth. But here's the irony, and this is the most ironic situation, the most paradoxical situation in the entire world today. And I mean that, and I would challenge anyone to come up with anything crazier than this. You saw the previous map. Where are most of the people? Red zones, right? What are the countries today that are depopulating, that are shrinking, that are losing people? The green countries, including us. right? Without immigration, our population would already be declining. Not will decline, would already be declining, right? Same goes for Canada, same goes for all of Europe, same goes for all of Russia, all of Scandinavia, and all of Japan. So, and Australia. I mean, every rich country in the entire world is depopulating, right? And you have a finite number of people, and you've got climate change. So the question is, it's a distribution question. So does it mean that everyone who's in a place where it is becoming very uncomfortable, a red zone, like must leave? No, not at all. There's a lot of things going on in mitigation of climate change, adaptation of climate change. But this is the big paradox when it comes to this. And so when you want to explain why not just millions, but billions of people, billions with a B, could be moving around in the future, climate is one important reason why, and here's the map that shows it.
Right, great. And so when so clearly we're going to see, more, movement of people. And when you look at particularly, one of the stories we talked about earlier was the sub-Saharan African migration that we're beginning to see flow into Europe. And that's going to have effects on European politics and European societies. And just like, the Central American migration that is coming to the United States. And here's where I want to talk about the politics of migration. Yeah. Because while, these are very convincing that we're going to see these migration flows, and maybe we need these migration flows, but the politics of migration often, it can be thorny, shall we say. Yeah. So talk about the politics of migration, and how do you get, people to think as migration as part of a solution instead of maybe the way some frame it as a problem?
Well, migration and demographics aren't just about sort of culture, identity, and territory. They're also about economics, right, fundamentally, right? A large, healthy, stable population with a good balance between old people and young people is the sweet spot. But you're not born into the sweet spot. You engineer the sweet spot, or it evolves, right? It's supply and demand, have driven immigration policy like for centuries, basically. And so America has sustained the sweet spot of having a large, growing, well-balanced, dynamic population for a really long time, longer than any other place by far. But that doesn't mean it's automatic, right? You need to have enough young people. You have to manage the economics of it, the dependency ratio. How many young taxpayers are paying into the system to pay out the Social Security payments for older people? And in Europe, the balance is so far out of whack that their debt to GDP ratios are through the roof. They don't have enough young people who are actually paying into the system. And their welfare state costs a lot more than our welfare state, right? But even then, we know that in the course of the 2020s or early 2030s, based on current spending patterns and tax inflows, even our Social Security system is struggling and creaking and so forth. So you've got to continuously have young people. So we don't tend to look at the world through the eyes of young people, which is the kind of point I want to make here. So when I was researching this book, I thought to myself, okay, well, if the world population is going to be 8 or 9 billion people, and most of those people are young, and many of them are in poor, developed countries, climate-stressed countries, places that are the origin of most migrants in the United States, right? Most migrants in the United States come from either Latin America or from Asia. And those that come from Asia primarily come from South Asia, like India and Pakistan and Southeast Asia and so forth. So that already today, America is the place where people from those poor, climate-stressed places come, but many of those places, they're also well-educated, like India and so on. So the picture that I'm painting, again, play the movie forward. You have climate change and climate stress and failing economies. You have our depopulation and the need for young people. And you have climate stress pushing people, in a way towards new places. You can actually square this circle, right? We can thread this needle. In fact, it's actually a really big hole. Like the phrase threading the needle makes it seem like it's really impossible. But I'm kind of saying it's common sense. It's common sense that you would say, okay, come all ye young people because we need you right now. Right? We need nurses, we need construction workers, we've got roads and bridges and tunnels that need work, we've got buildings that need to be built, we need caregivers, there are lots of huge labor shortages in the country. Part of the inflation effects in the country are due to labor shortages and inadequate labor. And we're not producing enough young people, and nothing that we can do. Looking at you over there, notice that's the youth wing of the room. Young people are not as inclined right now to have 3 or 4 kids. They're barely having 1 kid, right, if at all. So the math is literally pure arithmetic. It's not calculus. It's like, where are you going to get the young people from? How many do you need? What are they going to do? So that's what this slide is about. It's about the war for young talent. You said, the politics of immigration is thorny until you realize that it's really about economics, right? And yes, of course, it's also about identity, again, and territory and culture. But fundamentally, you'll make certain trades or compromises on issues to continue to have the stable economy that makes us great, that makes our life good and convenient. And that's the crossroads that a lot of countries are at. They're realizing that their quality of life, this incredible, fantastic, modern society, even the empire that we have built, and in Europe too, does require that young demographic to sustain it. Otherwise, your quality of life will actually be worse. Your life, your future will deteriorate. You don't just get to enjoy being at the pinnacle forever unless you have that blood, that youthful young blood. And there's 2 kinds of countries in the world. Those that precisely understand what I just said and they're already acting on it, and those that haven't. But everyone eventually gets there. Every country eventually gets there. So if you look at Canada, right? Canada is saying proactively, we want to import 400,000 people a year. That's 1% of the entire population, net new migrants from all walks of life, from all over the planet, many of them very skilled. And with those skilled migrants, they're building tech companies that are competing with Silicon Valley. They're diversifying away from commodities and timber and so forth into a wide range of sectors. They're building out new infrastructure. They're adapting to climate change. They're building new housing and so forth. Canada is absolutely thriving on the back of making immigration its economic policy. Like literally, immigration is its economic policy, and it's working big time, right? And Germany is starting to do this. And the UK, the same United Kingdom that did Brexit 6 years ago, is the same country that's turned around and realized, we need more young people. So it's easier today to move to England than it was before Brexit, because they realized the mistake they had made. They had a shortage of 100,000 truck drivers. They have a shortage of 150,000 doctors and nurses. That's embarrassing. There comes a point where you can't even call yourself a civilized society when you're not providing the benefits that you expect of a civilized society. I don't want our country to wind up like that. I don't want us to go down that route, and I don't need to be a futurist with a crystal ball to know that you need people to make things happen. So no matter how you feel about politics and identity and language and culture, fact is, a great society has the people that deliver that greatness. We got to get them from somewhere, and I believe we should compete. We always have, and we always will, and we always win anyway. Compete for the best and the brightest people from all over the world, and we can win again. So right now, again, no matter what my opinion or your opinion or anyone's opinion in Florida or elsewhere is on this topic, I just met with a congressional delegation, and they say that this year there'll be 1 million new immigrants in the United States from all over the world. Some will be great, some will be not so great, right? But there'll be 1 million. Like no country in the world comes anywhere near being able to say, we're ready to take 1 million people, we got jobs to fill, open the door, 1 million people sign up. There's not another place in the world that 1 million people want to go to, right? And that's despite all the tensions and so forth. So, it's ours to lose, right? This opportunity to pick all the best and the brightest, to pick all the smart youth, all the ones that are going to build our great companies and pave our roads and build our nursing homes and be our doctors and everything. We can take them or we can not take them. If we don't take them, other countries that need them will take them, and then life will actually be better in those places than it is here. Again, I don't want us to lose that. It's ours to win or to lose.
Right. I think it was Mark Twain who joked that immigration is the sincerest form of flattery, right? When you have, and it was where you live now, Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was famously said that when he was comparing China and the United States, and he said, well, China has 1.3 billion people to call upon, but the United States has 7+ billion, whatever the number was when he said that at the time, to call upon. And the argument was that there's so many people who want to come to the United States. There's a reason President Xi Jinping of China sent his daughter to study in the United States. And I think we sometimes maybe beat ourselves up a little bit here in the United States because we're a free society, but there is still a dynamism that a lot of people around the world see, and they want to be a part of that dynamism.
Exactly.
But so there's a passage from your book that I wanted to just read very quickly and just have you comment on it a little bit further. A staggering share of our personal and professional lives hinges on mobility, the movement of people, goods, money, and data within cities and countries, as well as internationally. Society only functions normally if we can move. Once you stop pedaling a bicycle, it quickly falls over. Our civilization is that bicycle, and move we will. You talk about quantum people, right?
Yeah.
How we are constantly moving. And here's where I wanted to open it up to a couple of other issues that are in the news, and then we'll take questions from all of you. One of the issues that has come up, and you and I have talked about this, is this idea that globalization is dying or declining, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I mean, you know where I stand on this. I'm not of that view, but I am going to take the adversarial position here and say, well, when you look at some of the trends, is globalization dying? Is globalization on the decline?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I'm glad you brought in that quote because the idea of mobility isn't just about people; it's everything. Right? We've created this very complex global system in which everything is fungible. Literally everything can be moved, even geography in a way. We move minerals, right? We move geological artifacts all over the world all the time. It's called oil, right? So everything is fungible, everything is movable, including people. And that's actually part of the broader beauty, you might say, of the system, but it also adds to the complexity. And that's what globalization is, the movement of anything between any 2 points, really, on the map, especially, of course, across borders. And you and I can remember, in the last 20 years, 4 times people have said globalization is dead. This is my direct retort to anyone who says globalization is dying. I say reserve your judgment, because the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened 21 years ago, and a lot of people said this is the end of globalization. So we cannot trust foreign societies anymore. We can't even get on a plane anymore. Why would anyone insure? Why would a bank insure foreign investment in these turbulent parts of the world after the 9/11 terrorist attack? So this was like a prevailing narrative, the death of globalization. And I was like, 22, 23 years old. I was like, oh man, globalization is dying. I'm so young. This is terrible. And then, a few years later, you had the financial crisis, right? 2007, 2008. Now then, people really said it's the death of globalization. Like, this was for real, right? Capital markets have frozen up. Foreign investment has dried up. Central banks are circling the wagons. Trade has collapsed, right? Supply chains have been disrupted, right? This great financial seizure. Again, everyone said, this is the end of globalization. But lo and behold, it wasn't, right? Things bounced back remarkably fast. Central treasuries, in particular, got together, stimulated global trade, and we were back to synchronized economic growth within 2 years. Then you had back-to-back in the summer and fall of 2016, you had Brexit and Trump. You had a 1-2 punch. Now, lots of people said, and even the young folks here can remember this, people said, this is the death of globalization, this is the end of globalization. It's all about America first, and look at what Brexit symbols, this domino effect of nationalism and protectionism and borders and walls. Globalization said. That was the 3rd time. I don't need to tell you about the 4th time because we're still living through it. It's COVID, right? Borders are closed, supply chains disrupted, you got to procure everything locally now, can't trust, China, and on and on and on and on. Again, death of globalization. Again, are you really so sure? Who wants to bet? Come on, anyone want to bet now? And that's only in the last 20 years. If I just extended the time horizon, I'd come up with 5 more examples of people saying globalization's dead. So I have some news for you, some good news, because in a world of uncertainty, maybe it's nice to have some certainties. Globalization always wins. Please remember this. Please repeat after me. Globalization always wins.
Right.
Whether or not you are a winner or a loser in this world depends on whether you are attached to to the waves of globalization or whether you are left behind by the waves of globalization. But don't lose any sleep about whether or not globalization survives. Worry about whether you are a winner as you're connected to it, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I believe in a laissez-faire flea market globalization. I don't. I believe that it takes a strategy to be a winner, right? We should not allow our industrial base to be eroded by low-cost markets without any countervailing measures to protect our workers, to protect our industries, and so forth, right? That would be unmoderated, unfiltered, non-strategic globalization, right? China doesn't do that. They're super strategic about it. Why aren't we more strategic about it? Now, we have been strategic in other ways. We're the ones who created modern globalization. We're the ones who pried open investment, capital markets, trade corridors. Our goods are exported everywhere. We've brought back that savings as other emerging markets have grown and built up their currency reserves. They've invested it here in our economy, keeping our interest rates down. We've been a really, really big winner, still the biggest winner by far. But there have been parts of the strategy that have been neglected. That doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? You don't kill globalization because of that. You calibrate your strategy, you go back, you keep on fighting. But globalization is always going to be there. Because it's the movement of everything. Right? Money is moving. Goods are moving. People are moving. Right? Data, bits are moving like never, ever, ever before. So don't you worry ever about globalization. Right. From an analytical standpoint, from an empirical standpoint, from a quantitative standpoint, by any measure, globalization is going to always keep on growing great guns, right? By almost any measure. And some areas where you might see it taper off, it'll increase in others, right? We didn't have the internet 30 years ago, my friends, right? Now, the value of the data crisscrossing the world instantaneously is worth a lot more than all the oil that is put in tankers and at any given day. That used to be a huge part of what we think of as like globalization. Today, if it disappeared, it would matter. Obviously, we're seeing what happens right now when oil is cut off. But what really has value in the world? What's really creating, money and capital and driving lots of different changes in our lives? It's digital technology. We didn't even have that globalization 30 years ago. So you and I are both, believers in this. Again, so think about, and one final thing on this is like, it's not just the country. When you're a huge country like us, it's also at the place. It's like, what is Florida's strategy in globalization? Miami has a globalization strategy. You better believe it. It has actually a pretty good one, right? San Francisco has a globalization strategy, but maybe Kansas doesn't, right? Or Michigan doesn't, right? So when you're a big country, every part of your body needs to have a strategy, not only domestically, which is how we play our congressional politics and how do we get the money out of the budget, but an international strategy too. So I advocate for that as well.
And another way to think about it, Parag, is that if any of you have had a vaccine, right, in many ways that's globalization in a needle, right? Because, you've had the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is 19 different, countries, some 80 plus different components. And by the way, the BioNTech was a company founded by the son and daughter of Turkish migrants to Germany, right? So it's a migration story as well. But that's globalization in a needle. If you've had coffee this morning, that's globalization in a mug. The coffee bean from Brazil or Ethiopia or wherever it came from, and there's a whole network of shippers and traders and roasters and futures traders who are trading the coffee futures, and then it comes to, so next time you drink your coffee tomorrow morning, I want you to think about globalization. Maybe it's too early in the morning to think about globalization, but so we're living with that, and then just before I turn it over to the General for some questions from all of you and from the audience online. Let's put the question of Russia on the table here, Parag, because let's look at it geopolitically. What is your initial reaction to what Vladimir Putin has done? And let's also add a migration element to it, because we're seeing a historic migration of Ukrainians across Europe.
Yeah. So, the fact that so suddenly, a war like this can break out and 5-6 million people are pushed out of what had heretofore been, kind of struggling but modernizing, very large, country like Ukraine, it just reminds you that everything's on a trigger to some degree, right? You never know you never take for granted your stability or your present circumstances. And as I mentioned before, this is just one of 7 conflict areas around the world that are producing more than 1 million refugees. Now, as someone who's formally focused on political geography, one of those maps I showed you earlier, I'm not so surprised about this. I'm surprised by the scale, the intensity. I mean, this has obviously caught everyone off guard, including all of us. But that it happened, no, because this was an unsettled border, right? And the world still has many settled, unsettled boundaries. We sometimes call them frozen conflicts. That's a term that I really revile. Because when we use the term frozen conflict, we say, oh, it'll be okay. It hasn't, showed up in the news lately. They seem pretty calm, and they'll work through it. So no. There is really no such thing as an unsettled or as a stable, unsettled border. It's either settled with both sides agreeing on exactly where that line is and exactly who owns what side of that line, or it's not. And if it's not, it's going to blow up. It might blow up tomorrow. It might blow up 5 years from now. It's going to blow up. I guarantee it. Because again, what right would we have to not agree with that? We've violently settled our border disputes. Every country has. Look at Europe as well, right? Why would we say to other people, you just deal with that ambiguity, that uncertainty? It's okay that you don't really have full sovereign control over your territory. We have the luxury of enjoying our sovereign control over our borders, but you don't. That's not fair, and that's not the way anyone else thinks. So if it's not settled, it's unsettled. If it's unsettled, they're going to war, right? And that's what happened here. Since 2008, when Putin was obviously very upset about the open-ended offer of Ukraine potentially eventually joining NATO, which wasn't really going to happen at the time, but definitely it turned him off. He immediately went into Georgia. Then in 2014, he seized Crimea. He took over more or less control of the Donbas region, installed pro-Russian militias there. So you had multiple unsettled boundaries and effectively, simmering conflicts in just Ukraine alone. So sure, it didn't, disturb our afternoon tea every day for the last, 8 years, but it sure did over there, right? And so I find that, it's disappointing that we didn't maybe do more to engage in just finding an active way to resolve it, right? Hopefully non-conflictually, but this is I don't want to say we had it coming, because I don't want to blame us instead of Putin, right? Another leader in Russia who's less psychotic would definitely have, taken perhaps an approach where we could sort of do business, right? That's not happening now. But it's just a reminder that this is not the only unsettled, boundary out there. We should do more to go out and settle them.
Very good. Thank you. So are there questions from anyone here? Yes. Yes, please, Scott. Great.
Got it? Okay, thank you. What kind of policies should cities look forward to stop displacement and protect current residents in current inland and northern cities as people move away from the coast?
All right, so we'll take them one at a time. So what's happening right now is that there are coastal areas that are so stressed, submerged, inundated, coastal flooding, sea level rise, storm surges, that the federal government now, this is FEMA talking, this is the Army Corps of Engineers, this is also HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. Together, these are three very important, federal agencies. They're saying we shouldn't let people rebuild here because it's, you're going to give a rebuilding grant of, $250,000 or something, and someone's going to rebuild a home, it's going to get destroyed again. So we now need to switch off certain areas or block certain areas, police line, do not cross, say it's time for people to move and to relocate. And that's what is happening, and it's not such a large number of people. Again, America is a gigantic country, right? So it's not such a big number that the internal climate migrants and sort of the relocation is going to overwhelm communities. In fact, to the contrary, there are significantly depopulated communities in America that really want to see more people come in. And that is the Rust Belt region, right? Upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and other areas. There are entire towns there right now that are saying, please come from Louisiana or coastal Texas or wherever, maybe parts of Florida, saying, please come and move here. You know, we've got tons of housing, right, that's been abandoned, vacated. The population of Detroit is a fraction of what it was at its peak. It was the largest city in the country, right, at one point. And so we've got plenty of space. You know, in New Hampshire and in Vermont and other towns there, again, they're branding themselves as climate havens, saying, hey, climate change is blessing us while it's cursing you down there. Come on up. So, you know, I'll never buy the argument that it's about space, right? It's actually about foresight. It's like saying, hey, wait a minute. Now, we don't want property prices to suddenly go through the roof in towns that are climate propitious but don't have a lot of infrastructure. So we need to think that through in advance and say, hey, how about we build some more housing? We can do that, right? It can be nice suburban homes. It can be 3D printed housing. It can be mobile trailer parks, whatever the case may be. But we've got plenty of space, plenty of work to do in those places, and we'll save a lot on our insurance bill, you know, in the sort of like, take the Geico lizard at a national level, right? You're not gonna pay as much for your insurance if you live in a climate resilient area. And so, you know, we need to think about, again, the economic side of this as well. Again, I'm talking about threading that needle, that big needle, right? We can save a lot of money as a society by gradually creating living conditions in slightly more stable areas. Doesn't mean you have to move thousands of miles, right? It could be just 5 or 6 miles. In Germany last summer, you may have seen it in the news, it was horrific. The flooding in Western Germany was unreal. This was like, you know, biblical floods, right? It was really, really off the charts. Tens of thousands of people, homes completely destroyed. But Germany's super organized, right? They're just gonna, people just have to move a couple of miles, right, up a hill. They're gonna rebuild there. Everyone is still in the place that they hold dear, right? But it's the foresight. You know, we've got our topographical modeling too, right? We know what places are gonna be just fine, and there's plenty of them right here in Florida, for sure. So I think we need to start applying those tools. You know, think about the, what are the models telling us about the best places to be, and then start to nudge people in those places, start to build the right infrastructure in those places, and we'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. We're never going to get to all these questions, so please forgive me in advance here. The next one has to do with competition of labor, and said, do you see collectivist or individual societies as having an advantage in competing for high productivity immigrants?
Oof,
All right,
it's a great question.
And we'll do speed round. So
Speed
we'll try
round,
to
yeah.
get through
Okay,
as many
so
as we can. Yeah.
Definitely not a speed round.
Yeah.
This deserves about a 4-hour lecture. The answer is, you know, you can't really generalize just based upon the culture of the society, whether it's individual or collectivist. Of course, people who are seeking, you know, kind of total freedom of entrepreneurialism and so forth will, you know, gravitate towards individualist societies, but even collectivist societies have lots of entrepreneurial dynamism today. You can see that, in fact, not least in China itself. So no necessary future correlation, even if in the past there has been a correlation. So there's your speed round answer.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. On nationalism, how do you think nationalism will affect migration of young people around the world, and how will religion play a factor?
Great. So this is very interesting because we live in an era where we think of, like, you know, the return of strongman nationalism. You know, look at Erdogan and Putin and Modi in India and Xi Jinping in China. I'll tell you what the ironclad correlation is. Nationalist countries are the places that people want to leave, not the places people want to go to. And that's not like my opinion, that's like an absolute fact, right? China, people want to leave China. They're fleeing Chinese nationalism, suppression, so forth. India is the #1 source of outward migrants on the planet by like this much. You got to break the graph 5 times, right? Everyone's leaving India. Everyone with a brain, with skills, get me out of there, right? Nationalist government. Turkey, You can't pay. I have a chapter of the book on military conscription. They have conscription in Turkey. So you think, okay, well, nationalist society, young people want to serve their country, serve their military. Well, guess what every 18-year-old man in Turkey wants to do? Raise that 5,000 lira to bribe the government to escape conscription and get the hell out of the country. Pardon my language, right? So nationalism is directly correlated to emigration. Right? You can see it in Italy with their bad populist governments and so on. So, that's young people don't want to be suppressed. Young people want to be in places where they get to discover their identity, get to focus on skills, education, and jobs, and live an affordable life in a tolerant society. That's what every young person in the world seems to want based on every survey I've ever read. And guess what? Young people, they've never been more surveyed than any demographic in human history because they're on Facebook. Right, and Instagram and whatnot. So I'm not making this up, right? We've never psychoanalyzed anyone as much as we've psychoanalyzed the couple of billion young people in the world. And what I just said is what they want. And they don't seem to want nationalism in their daily diet.
And speaking of surveys, just very quickly, the Arab Youth Survey, I recommend you all look at it. It's done every year, and they've done about 12 years of it now. And they asked this question about if you could migrate outside your country, would you? And overwhelmingly, the numbers are very high. But what's also very interesting is that when they ask them if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you like to live? And usually the number one answer of the past 6-7 years running has been the UAE, United Arab Emirates. What they really mean is Dubai. They all want to go to Dubai. But the United States is number 2 in that list. So I think that's worth looking at.
Well, again, another tangential question about migration is climate migration. And this person asked, what do you see as the most effective strategy for adapting to climate change? And relatedly, how can we avoid nationalistic backlashes to large-scale climate migration?
Great question. So the best adaptation strategy is migration, right? Because you can't guarantee that the seawall that you're building, whether it's in Miami or Venice or Jakarta, is really going to hold back the water, right? One thing you can Google is the Thames barrier, the River Thames in London. At the eastern end, as it becomes the Thames estuary heading out to the Atlantic Ocean, the water is coming in. And they've built this really impressive engineering marvel known as the Thames Barrier. And at high tide, when the Atlantic Ocean surge comes in, it's like if that were not there, London would not exist. Like it would already be flooded today, like one of the world's 3 most important, financial centers. So I'm not going to put all my faith in that one, barrier. So the safest adaptation strategy is to move, but we can build more resilient infrastructure for sure. We can do a lot of things around, again, coastal flood controls and mangroves and so forth to absorb rising tides, this kind of thing. So there are engineering solutions, but the safest bet is some degree of partial relocation. And again, the backlash against climate migration depends on where. Look, I want to say, I should have mentioned it earlier, but Florida is the world's #1 destination for climate refugees. We don't officially call it that. It isn't the congressionally designated term, but Florida is the #1 destination on the planet Earth for climate refugees, right, from the Caribbean, and most never go back. So sure, New Zealand, the Prime Minister will get Nobel Prizes for accepting, 10 people from Tonga on a climate visa program, but here, we do it. Again, this is all part of America being America and absorbing those millions of people that we do, and a lot of it is those climate, and we don't bat an eye. I mean, yes, there is sort of, whoa, that's a huge surge, from the storm there, and look what happened in the Bahamas and Puerto Rico and so on. But ultimately, we do take it in stride. We can absorb these populations. We have a deep, deep set of cultural relationships and economic relationships with them. So I'd like to think that, look, we have, unfortunately, for better or worse, it's happening. So let's prepare for it. Let's absorb it. There'll be less backlash then.
Okay. Well, thank you. And for this evening, thank you again, Parag and Afshin, for being here. Thank you also to you, our members and our sponsors and our friends who've joined us this evening. So with that, we're going to conclude the 2021-22 season, and we'll convene again, but not until September 14th as we welcome Malcolm Turnbull, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia. So thank you for allowing me to be chairman of your organization here, and have a wonderful summer, and we'll see you again in the fall.
Thank you.